All right, so just in the interest of time, we'll go ahead and get started. Our speaker today is Dr. Becky Carmichael. She is the Communication Across the Curriculum Science Manager for the Colleges of Agricultural, Coast and Environment, and Science, and instructor for the College of Science and Ogden Honors College at Louisiana State University. In these roles, she focuses on science-specific communication development, assignment and curriculum design, feedback strategies, and pedagogy for faculty and students. Becky continues to explore how science communication manifests across multimodal platforms to inform her instructional efforts, including the environmental science course Global Views, taught collaboratively with colleagues at San Jose State University and Scott Community College. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Carmichael.
Thank you so very much. I'm excited to join your seminar today and really get to talk about that course, Global Views, how the inspiration for that class, and how we did it. And I just had one moment while I relocate where my slide deck is. There it is. Okay. So I need to. I'm sorry, I just had it. Alice and I were just talking about how we used Zoom so frequently during, that thing we all did together, the pandemic. And then all of a sudden, I have apparently forgotten how to use Zoom, but I'm back now. So yes, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure, and I am really excited to kind of talk you through what we did, and then if you're inspired, how we did it, if you want to add it to your own course. I will also say that my training is in disturbance ecology. That was what my background was in, and now in my role, I've done this academic adjacent kind of position where I get to work with faculty and support them in the development and design of their class. My colleagues have also realized as they've gone on to other universities that that's been my job. And so I will get frequent calls, or we'll have conversations about, what are we doing here at LSU? Or can I brainstorm with them about what they're trying to achieve in their class? And this is kind of one of those situations. And so let me go to the next slide. So the way in which this particular course, the inception of it was really through a conversation between myself, Dr. Matha Clock, who was working at San Jose State University in California, and Dr. Tracy Himlowski, who is teaching at Eastern Iowa Community College. And this was near the beginning of the pandemic, so in 2020, and when everyone was scrambling to figure out how they were not only going to be able to teach their courses for that spring semester, but also just to find a way in which they could connect with their family, their friends, and their loved ones when that physical connection just disappeared overnight. We found ourselves on Zoom and chatting. And so they were talking to me about, what was happening in their lives, as well as, what changes that they were making for those classes. And then I was sharing with them things that we were organizing here at Communication Across the Curriculum at Louisiana State. And through this kind of conversation on Zoom, we realized we had a very unique opportunity. All three of us were going to be teaching a environmental science or a conservation biology course. We were all going to be teaching it via Zoom in either a synchronous or asynchronous capacity. And also, COVID really presented this moment where we realized that it was important for connection. And it was an opportunity for us to dive into those connections, how we as communities interact and respond to different situations similarly and distinctly from each other. We also recognized that our three institutes had a very unique student population. So I was teaching an honors course at LSU. The students are predominantly white. Many of them are from either Louisiana or the southern states. We do get some from the East Coast and other parts, but that's predominantly who we are. And they happen to be incoming freshmen for the most part, though I do get some that are in those upper levels. Maith, on the other hand, is teaching at a school where it's predominantly Latinx, first generation students with migrant family members, the people that have come in from different places around the world, and this is where their students are learning. And then Tracy was teaching at a community college, a 2-year community college, where students were either going and getting their associate's degree and then going on to industry, or they were going into Iowa State University to continue on with their education. And her students had a range of ages. Some of them were similar to mine in being 18-year-olds, but others were those non-traditional students that had families and they were working around a very different schedule. So when we took all of this into account, we decided we couldn't squander this opportunity. We had to use it in some capacity to learn, both for ourselves, but also for our students, and really lean into what happens when we as citizens come together and learn from each other. How do our perspectives for what is happening in our circle influence how we interact with others? And what could this mean in terms of how we're approaching the world? So a lot of themes that could touch on COVID as we were all experiencing at that time, but then also broadly, if we think about what we were doing for environmental sciences. And so with that, we focused really in on what we were doing with our environmental classes. So our main goals were we wanted the students to be able to connect on those environmental issues that we all shared. And as you see, I have an image here of a global like temperature changes for the planet. So we really honed in on how are we perceiving climate change, how are we perceiving the related aspects of natural disasters, and what happens within our communities. So we wanted them to kind of think about, getting at those perspectives. The other piece we wanted to work on is how do we collaborate among communities? And this collaboration was really important in terms of how are we working together? How are we understanding that what happens in Iowa has rippling effects to us in Louisiana, etc. We also wanted to focus within that, how do we work in teams? I have long used the phrase life is one group project, and we're always having to do something in groups, whether we like to work in groups or not. And so how can we make that a more amenable process so that we can connect and we can actually move the needle forward on some pretty big issues? We also felt it was very important to learn how to communicate. And yes, I'm coming from that CXC background where communication is important. We communicate across 4 modes: writing, speaking, visuals, and technological. So of course, that was something that I wanted to make sure was embedded in this course. But also, we as a collective wanted to really emphasize interpersonal communication and understanding how lived experiences can affect how and what you're thinking and how you're interpreting information when it comes to you. And finally, kind of the purpose and the inspiration of this class is connection. And I specifically wrote instructor connection. And I think that, we always talk about those peer-to-peer connections that we want to make foster for our students. But there's also this part where we as instructors have to find ways in which we can prop each other up, brainstorm with each other, support each other through situations, and lean in on those connections, even if it is 3 people getting together on Zoom and just sharing an evening together. So this is kind of where we were. Now, as I've said, the peer-to-peer interaction was particularly important for us. And so based on everything that I just said, we were going to make sure that we were going to give our students the opportunity to engage with someone else in their community. And we were really defining community in different ways, because again, we wanted them to kind of play in these interactions so that they were better prepared both for learning this content, but also for the future. And we had some information, we understood the theory behind peer learning. So if I think about in a Q and kind of his pivotal work in HIPS, high impact practices, we knew that when students tend to collaborate through team-based learning projects, that they tend to retain that information better. They're also contributing their ideas, and it involves in deeper engagement in that learning process of that content. We also knew that when we put peers in together, this is also requiring them to learn at a deeper level. So really critically evaluating that information so that they can understand it. And then finally, when you do put them in those situations where they're really having to think about this content and think about where they stand and have these conversations, they're contributing their own lived experiences. And that personal perspective is something that is very important when we're talking about big issues. So when we're talking about environmental issues, we're talking about climate change issues, or we're even talking about, what are we doing in terms for COVID or other kinds of pandemics that may be headed our way? How do we need to take on these other cultural aspects, these other lived experiences, so that we can be better when we're entering personal communication? And then since we had those students that were part of the industry, they were heading into other programs, we also really cued in on the Association of American Colleges and Universities and their study that they did with employers, asking what they wanted students to be able to have when they became into their industries. And some of those top pieces were just those things I said. They wanted those students to be able to work in teams. They wanted to be able to analyze and critically evaluate that content. They wanted them to have an understanding of real world applications, and they needed them to be able to communicate. And so based on all that theory for them, that how this was going to help them learn in that team setting, and then how it was going to benefit them moving forward, these are the justifications that we not only set up for ourselves in proposing this as a project, but also when we were working with our students in our classes, how we were showing what they could get out of it and why they should stay in the class in the first place. So at this point, I want to walk you through the anatomy of what Global Views became. That kind of gave you a little bit of a setup, and then now I want to just kind of share the steps. The big reveal here is that for this class, we were asking our students to create web pages inside of a Global Views website. We used Google Site because, one, it was free for our students. It was fairly easy to edit and manipulate. And because we knew that was going to be the way for our institutions to be able to collaborate effectively, and it was bigger than just a shared Google Doc, we had to think about, kind of in that backward design fashion, how are we going to build this out so they could successfully complete these pages. I will tell you that across our 3 institutions, our class sizes were fairly small. We had anywhere from 20 to at most 30 students per section. And as I said previously, the students ranged from 18-year-olds to upwards of 50 years in age. So incoming freshmen to non-traditional students and others in between. Matha and Tracy and I sat down. We thought about kind of the goals that we wanted to have overarching our courses. And first and foremost, we wanted to make sure that the students developed a scientific understanding of environmental issues and events, and then they developed a understanding of foundational ecology and conservation biology concepts. We also wanted them to understand how the relationship between the human activities and the natural processes, how those influenced each other. And both when we think about the just physical effects, but then also environmental justice, cultural livelihoods, and resiliency within a society. What were those relationships? How were they connected? The fourth goal that we had was for them to be effective collaborators with each other, both in their home base, but also across the United States, because they're not going to stay in that classroom forever, and they've got to figure out how to navigate those relationships moving forward. And finally, we especially wanted them to be able to understand how to locate and then evaluate reliable information that then they could effectively communicate and translate for others. So really developing that science literacy. At this point, I should say that some of our students were science majors, but some were not. They were coming from other disciplines, everything from political science to global health and to different engineering backgrounds. And so for us, even though they were not within a science field, we wanted them to have a firm understanding about where to find that information that was reliable and how to translate that for both themselves and for others when they interact. So as I said previously, we had like that peer-to-peer interaction was really important. And so for us, we designated different levels of peer engagement. So first, when I say home, each one of us, we called our institution our own classes. That was our home community. And so those peers that were in the same class, they were going to be interacting with each other both in teams, but also among teams within the classroom setting. The students also had interactions with each other through their partnered institutions. And so for the sessions that I taught, I was partnered with Tracy Hemlowski at the community college in Iowa. And so the home team, they had their other partners there and their peers. And so they got to learn about them. Whoops. And then also we wanted them to be connecting with that broader community. So there was impetus on really researching this well and putting the best effort possible in developing these web pages, because these web pages are live. And so the broader community, the world, could even be dialing in and looking at this information and learning from what our students collectively put together. So multiple levels, and getting them to see that at each one of these stages, they have peers, they have connections, and they're part of a bigger community. We've picked 7 broad topics for our students to select from. And these broad topics ranged, as you see here, from endangered species to invasive species, energy, food production, land management, pollution, and water. And so within these big, broad topics, we knew that no matter what region they were from, they should be able to find subtopics within. I've used the bird foot here of Louisiana because every single one of these broad topics, they could find something to talk about if they wanted to stay local. And it was really telling too when they started to have to tease out overlap. So many times my students that were in the water group would be also talking about energy. They would also be talking about land management. So we ended up forcing them to kind of tease out how they separated from each other. So my students formed groups or teams based on these topics. Now they could have selected partners that they already wanted to work with and then pick a topic, or they could have picked a topic and then the teams would form. For me, I let my students select who they wanted to work with after we did a short session on what are characteristics of a strong team. And so we talked about, what do you want to look for? It's not always your best friend that goes on the same team with you. They have to have some characteristics to be, that complement and also keep everyone accountable for what they're doing. Then what we did, once they were in their teams, we did 2 contracts. So we did a team contract that then made them go through different aspects of their team and identify them. So they had to document what were the skills that they were contributing to that group and what was their working style. So for instance, my class was an honors course. I have a lot of honors students pretty much. And they tend to all want to have control of what they're doing. And it's difficult sometimes to relinquish some of that control and put trust in others. We had to document how they were going to do that and how they were going to flex their roles and responsibilities to ensure everything was completed on time. They had to document who was going to be submitting information. They also were required to put together a communication plan. And this could be, how frequently were they going to talk to each other, in what spaces, when were they going to have regular meetings, were they going to meet in a Google Doc, for example. But we needed this documented early on in the semester before they even started with the rest. They also had to talk through how they were going to give feedback to each other. And so again, we talked through what is critical feedback and what is constructive feedback, and how is that important for the growth of your knowledge and your abilities. And we gave them strategies for making sure that it wasn't an ouch when they received critique, but rather talking through its supporting each other so we learn. And then finally, they had to put together a conflict management plan. And this is where many of my students got to redo their team contract, because they would write things like, we're all going to get along. And I said, that's fantastic. I want to live in that world. But unfortunately, sometimes we don't. So we've got to put a plan together, right? So if someone's not turning in materials on time, what are the steps that you're going to take to inform them that they're not? And how are you going to make sure that you can move on if someone, for whatever reason, is unable to complete the tasks that they said they had? We also talked through then what happens when someone gets sick. So again, remember, we're in the middle of this pandemic. We have a heightened awareness that we are not all invincible. So how do we support when one team member does get sick? How do we make sure that their work is complete so that we can keep the project moving forward? The class contract was a little different in the sense that it was more broad for everyone to put their signature on. And that was them stating they would maintain professionalism, and they understood the code of conduct that we needed to maintain as as their institute, their kind of academic role. This was an insurance policy, if you will, because I'll tell you later, they were going to be interacting with these other institutions. We wanted them to know that they were representing their institution and they needed to be professional. And so they were still under that code of conduct. Now, once we did all these pieces, then my students started to divide up in their groups, and they selected what was going to be their individual research project. So even though this is team driven, we had individual components so that they knew they had a unique responsibility here. And so what they ended up doing, for instance, we could do the broad topic of water. They could select from a variety of different subtopics that both were connected, but yet distinct enough that they could go and do their research. And so at this point, they were then going in and doing research papers. And we asked them specifically to do scientific-based research papers. They had to pull in reliable referencing. And I'm using reliable referencing instead of peer review here, because we allowed them not only to use those peer-reviewed sources for the data, but we also wanted them to understand how they could use news sources effectively. How could they use popular journals such as a Scientific American or National Geographic, for instance, to get the content that they need. They were required to write these in a scientific style. And we, for all uniformity across institutions, we asked them to use APA as their citation format. And within those research papers, not only did they kind of have to dig into their own topic and uncover it, talk about the stakeholders that were involved, communities that were affected, they had to link it back to the other broad topic effectively, as well as touch on their team members' topics. We asked them to connect it to climate change, as well as provide an action plan. In two different moments, we asked them to meet with their away team. This is none of my students, but this is a wiki education group. So if you go on Wikipedia, you can get the same picture, but I like their smiling faces. And so what we ask our students to do first and foremost was earlier in the semester to coordinate with their partner teams and have a session that was an icebreaker. Get to know each other, ask each other questions, talk to each other about your broad topic, because at that point they'd had their broad topics, and learn from each other. And so if they were going to be doing a particular, say if they were going to be doing pollution, if Louisiana students were doing that topic, what does pollution look like in Iowa? What does it look like in Louisiana? How do they interplay? They did that first early on so that they could get comfortable, because of course it's pretty awkward when you don't know anyone on that other side of Zoom and you're asked to talk to them. So we were also, again, this was our area of trying to work on those interpersonal skills, because many times in our lives we're going to be talking to people that we don't know. How do you quickly establish a comfort level so that you can engage with them? And so with that, then later in the semester, they did a practice presentation of their broad topic to each other. And in this case, this is their second meeting. Both of these sessions are recorded, by the way, for them. But in that second session, then they're leading off with their group talks, and they're giving a preview of how they're going to cover their independent or their individual subtopics. Both teams were required to, one, be on the call and also give each other feedback. And this really helped to see then for these teams, where was some overlap, and then where could they link to each other's sections in the bigger website. And so this to me was a really kind of telling moment. We could really see those lived experiences and different perspectives coming out and being presented. Now, our sneaky thing that was happening during this was we were working with our students on collaboration with others and coordinating a time when they could all meet. And so this was really kind of a time where they really had to think about how were they going to make this work, especially when someone might be working. And so this to me was one of my favorite parts, was watching them interact. The next stage of this was their individual web pages. So once the students wrote their papers, they wrote it as a draft, I gave them feedback, they got feedback from peers within the classroom as well. They then had to take that research paper and translate it into a web page within the bigger global views page too. And this required them to think and look at existing web pages within the topic. So we did some class evaluation. They got to just search for some topics and look up how it was being presented. So we did a lot of feedback sessions in that space. What's working? Where does your eye go? How do you navigate through this information? They did draft pages of their individual subtopics for review. Again, they got feedback from myself, they got feedback from their classmates, and they also got feedback from their peered institution. And then once they had those individual pages shored up and ready to go, they put them among a broader topic page for their institution and with their partners. And that was where they had to make it look very cohesive, and so that nothing was orphaned from the others. So we gave them a pretty big charge here, but I'm happy to say that they were able to make this work. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to exit out of my presentation for a moment. I'm going to take you into what we did. Let me close out of here. And can everybody still see my screen and my webpage? Perfect. So here's the website that we created for the spring of 22. And in this page, we see this is saying Scott Community College up at the front. We give a little blurb about kind of what our students were doing, and you can access those different web pages or those different sections here. I should say that because it was Google Sites, we were able in this space to not only allow them to do invasive species, for example, but this is also where we gave them a sample page to show them how we as faculty would think about putting this together. And so we talked really heavily about language, layout, word selection. And so even though we're going to talk about those ecological impacts of house cats, we're going to give you a hook, right? They're cute and they're cuddly, but they're also killing machines. We were able to kind of go in here in class live and make edits for them to see so that they could also get comfortable. When you go into their student pages, and we went into the water page, it first takes you to choose between which institution you want to explore. They gave a little blurb about what was going to be within this, so that as a viewer, I know what I'm getting ready to click into and potentially what I'm going to see. And then that takes us to our team's broad topic page. And so for here, again, they worked as a team to write this section. They had to agree upon what kind of imaging they wanted to include. And then they laid out their particular topics they were going to cover. They connected this to climate change with citations. And then as we scroll down, For this team, I was showing you this one because they also linked it out to external websites. So if someone gets to this point, they can learn more. And then you can go and read and know a little bit more about the contributors themselves. Now, we did not require them to put their faces on here. That was up to them how much they wanted to share about themselves in this very public space. So I'm going to scroll up. And so then once that was kind of the team, you could go into their individual pages. And this team in particular, they really worked on cohesiveness. So they wanted to have a similar feel as you went down through the multiple layers. So for this particular student, they really got into, the water pollution was nothing new. They were digging through EPA documents from the 1970s to find information, and they were quite shocked that nothing had really changed in particular aspects. And they wanted to capture it here. I was really excited when they picked up, Cancer Alley. This linked to some other pages as well. And they gave someone, here's some actions that we can do. I will also go ahead and pop over. I'm actually going to go back one. And you could see some of this similar layout even if you go to something like waterborne diseases. So because they were all talking to each other and they were very much working continuously in some capacity, they were putting all of these places and pieces together. For our waterborne diseases, what I thought went well for this student was they really got in and they leaned into what's happening in Iowa, what are the issues there, why should we be concerned? But then also more of a global impact. So oysters or something and seafood or something is very important for the Gulf Coast region. How do we as a nation need to be concerned? What are those ideas? And then breaking them and making them broader. Let me go back into this. I'm going to stop sharing for a second and go back in. This is where I know I mess up. There it is. That's what I need to do. No, it's not. Here's where I want. So the students put together these web pages. They had lots of feedback. They had lots of interaction. And then once this was done, we asked the students to individually evaluate their team and then themselves through this process. And so this is a sample of the rubric that we've used. I've used this actual rubric for other group projects I've done. But this was one where they had to rate themselves. What was their contribution? How did they contribute to those deliverables? And they could give everyone 100 across the board, but they had to justify that. Why did they think that everyone deserved that score? We also asked them to do some self-reflection on the process of working with a group and also learning about environmental issues. And so the sample questions were pulled from the prompts we used to kind of help them in that reflection toward the end of the semester. As an instructor, I found this particularly helpful that we gave me some information right in the moment where I could apply it to the next class that we were planning, and I could share that with my colleagues across those across those institutions, so that as they were preparing, we could compare, was this uniform? Is this something that we need to address? Is this something that we need to say as a big hurrah and be excited about? So a couple of the unexpected outcomes through this process. So I have shared with you the shiny, pretty part of this, but I got to tell you, there were some things that were a little off, but then there's some things that really just were wowed. So that first icebreaker that we did, those were recorded, and I watched all of them. And I watched all of them. Some of them were maybe 30 minutes. One was an hour and a half. And I just, I wanted to see kind of where were they at, what were they doing? And I was amazed with all of the students that were involved, because yes, they did what the questions that we had given them as initial prompts to get started, but they really started to explore each other as people. And so we had questions about, is it really snowing in Iowa? What does it feel to touch snow? What is ice like? What is it like to drive on there? Do you really have a top golf? And can I come down and visit you and we go play a top golf? We also had some questions that were a little bit maybe not as appropriate, but they gave us this opportunity to talk about professionalism and setting and, at what point can you ask questions if you can ask those questions at all. We also had in-class opportunities to where my colleague Tracy Hemlowski and I had some overlap when she was teaching and when I was teaching. And we took that 20-minute overlap and we Zoomed our entire classes together. And so we did a little competition on who knew most about each other's capital. And it was in that moment that not only did they go and they learn about each other's locations to kind of answer and ask questions, but then they also had some time to just talk to each other. And this was in February of 2022, and all of my students were essentially in shorts and t-shirts. And the Iowa students really picked up on this fast. And then my students had to ask them about what was up with corn and how much corn did they actually consume. So we got into some of those stereotypes, right? Some of the other things that I was really that really got to me as an important moment was the flexibility and the compassion that students had for each other, even if they were only meeting briefly through Zoom. As I mentioned, we had some students that were all across age ranges and in different stages of their life. And I really admire that they took it upon themselves to be extremely flexible when scheduling these sessions. So some of my students had talked about, we stayed up and jumped on at 10:30 at night because that's when this person's shift ended. Or there was a parent who had 3 children, young children at that. They agreed to get up with them at 5:30 to jump on a Zoom call and do it because that was her window at that time. And then there was also some inspirational things that happened. And so I have these 2 longer quotes, but these were some thoughts that came out from them. And I'm going to move my little window over here so I can read these. One was our class and my continued work in environmental communication with diverse groups led me to recognize that I will be a better, more empathetic and nuanced leader in both local and international communities if I critically study how humans interact with the environment from historical, philosophical, and cultural lenses. So that particular quote was given to me this year because this student had talked about, this was her freshman year in this class. She thought she knew where she was going to head. And it was at these interactions she had with these students that propelled her into another avenue and to bolster where she was going. Another student had wrote that their experience with the island students led her to realize the need for a better multi-state regulations after seeing how agricultural runoff from upriver combined with petrochemical pollution downriver makes Louisiana bear the brunt of many states' pollution. This experience contributed to both my desire to address environmental problems across borders and facilitate collaboration between local, state, and national governments to do so. That particular student, I see them quite a bit showing up and doing different political and legislation actions and working with nonprofits within our state. And so these were some of those unexpected outcomes that we're really excited to see. I also want to talk to you a little bit about, some lessons learned and some limitations that we had. And so some of the big lessons that we realized first and foremost was that contracts were necessary. It's still group work, and we have to figure out and devise ways in which students can effectively work in groups, but not all groups are going to function like we want them to do. The contracts were really helpful because it at least gave plans for our students to take, some action plans before they came to us. And it also laid out the outcome or the result for if someone didn't contribute, what was going to be the consequence for doing so. Also, to having that class document was really important. During the very first semester, we did have a situation to where one student in the recorded Zoom said some disparaging comments to the entire group. And it was on it, what was said was against kind of academic policy. So we were able to handle that and then take this as an insurance policy moving forward so that students would learn this is a professional space. We also needed to ensure that we had time during the semester within our home institutes for dedicated interaction. So I think it's already a challenge for them to interact and find time to connect with their partnered institution. So we wanted to make sure that when they're in their home base, we gave them time in class to connect, to work on things. And also that was an opportunity for us to revolve around and give each other feedback. And so for me, I had at least 2 class periods that were dedicated to that interaction. Expectations across all courses involved during that semester need to be similar. So because I was teaching an honors class, one of the first semesters, I had added a couple of things in for them to do. And in those icebreakers and those presentation times, my honors students, being very helpful, told the Iowa students, oh, hey, heads up, this is going to be due. And the Iowa students were like, wait, we don't have that. It caused a little bit of a panic. And so we wanted to make sure that everybody had similar deadlines, similar assignments. The other thing that, and we do have that, we've laid out this in multiple steps that are scaffolded, but also too, we wanted to have similarity in how we were going to evaluate them. And so we have a series of rubrics for each stage that we all use across the 3 institutes. And finally, for the lessons is that they should all be using LSU email for that communication, and they should not be giving each other their phone numbers. One, we had to talk about, again, professionalism and how your university email is a professional business email, if you will, and that's where you should have this communication. You shouldn't be giving out personal information until you really truly know that person, even if you're working together in a class situation. Some of the limitations that we discovered were our time zones. So Iowa and Louisiana are on the same time zone. However, California is 2 hours behind us. And so that kind of made it a little bit difficult when we were scheduling times to meet those students. And likewise, the class time meeting, I will be completely transparent and say throughout this program or this project, only 2 institutes at a time were able to meet. Not all 3 institutions were able to connect at the same time because of things out beyond our control as instructors. So when we did think that the 3 of us were going to be able to meet, say Maytha's time course load got changed, and so things just changed in that capacity. And so with that, I'd like to open it up for kind of questions and hear if there's anything that I can share with any of you. While I open this up, I'm going to drop the link to the website down in our chat to share with you as well. Sharing. Caroline has a question and Maria has a question.
Hi, thank you so much. This was such a cool seminar, very relevant to my work also, so I'm like furiously taking notes. But because like grading is such an important like institutional facet, how did you deal with having to translate their personal and professional growth into a grade?
That's a great question. So we did use a rubric for each part of the scaffolded, like the components. And so one of the ways personal growth is a little more subjective on my part. So for me, in my class, I looked at improvement overall. So I looked at where my students all started, and I had a we can call it I called it like a participation or activeness score, and I used that to say, if I saw someone who was really, really working hard, and you could see that through their grades, and you could see that improvement through their assignments, I could give them that score toward the end. We did inside the rubrics put in things like, professional writing and composition. And so we had lines to score them in that way to get toward those other components. And I'm happy to show any of those two with you if you're interested.
Awesome. Thank you.
I don't have a question right now, but I just love Dr. Becky Carmichael. And I mean, at some point it would be cool to see, or could you maybe talk about, and I guess I do have a question, about some of the things that you put in that contract, like go into more depth about that group work, and like the logistics around that, because I know a lot of students get nervous about group work, but there's, like you said, life is a group project.
Life is a group project. And for full transparency, Maria and I used to work together. I had the pleasure of having her work with me in the studio. I've missed her as a very close collaborator, but we still get to collaborate. I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'm just going to pop into some files. And so this is my colleagues and I used Google Docs, Google Drive. One, because again, it's free. We can all see who and did what, when, and where. And while this all has me as the owner, this is because I did do a little tailoring, like putting in, this was for Honors 1035. So if I pop into the contract here, everybody can still see this contract. Perfect. These were some of the kind of questions. So this is their assignment one. We gave it like 20 points. I am blanking on how many points we had for the entire class, so I apologize. We had them pick out a fun name if they wanted to, and then we gave them this detail of prompts. So while I put on the slide deck skills and work style, we actually gave them some prompts to answer. I will say that this particular contract is not 100% mine. I have borrowed this and modified it from others before me. But for us, they had some space to really kind of write down details. And you'll see where I've said, make sure to describe this explicitly. And this is more than I want an A in the class. Like, what do you really want to get out of it? And trying to get them to think through, you're in a college situation and it's about more than the grade. There's the content behind it. How are you going to apply that? Does this answer your question too, Maria? Okay. The roles and responsibilities, I think that is really important. Everybody's got to contribute, but how, like for this instance, how will missing components be redistributed if a team member is unable to complete them? So this is if somebody is gets sick or if they kind of drop out, and they're not communicating, how are you still going to take on this work? And I felt like in this case, it can seem like a burden. I did take note of when this was happening in teams. And I gave them grace in this situation, but I also wanted to give them some kinds of strategies to prepare when this happens in real life.
Thank you. That's awesome, Becky. I really appreciate how you always don't take for granted that we know how to do these things like effectively for the long haul. And it changes every time too.
It does. And I think that, at the end of the day, if I can get them to think about, well, one, it would be lovely if they're all got really excited and they wanted to go into environmental areas and they wanted to do these things to kind of make the world a better place. And they're all going to do that. They're just going to go into those spaces that might not be in the same route that I'm on. And I want them to have some strategies and some skills that are flexible. But likewise, even if they're in a class where it's not necessarily what they think they want to do, they can see how it can be applicable in other places. Ray, you have a question.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciated the reflectiveness behind each of the components of this. I'm wondering, a lot of my work is also in mindfulness I work in ocean science. And so I'm wondering if you have insights on, I'm thinking of this project specifically, do you have any prep work or things to help the students kind of get in that framework that even though this is a an environmental class, this is kind of in the social science aspect.
Yeah. Oh, I like that. So some of the things that we did was we did ask them, we would have them do some readings, right? And I would pull readings that were both situated in science, but I also pulled in the human component. So what was happening in legislation, what was happening across history. We did read into, we definitely read into environmental justice and environmental racism issues. Because I wanted them to think about who takes on the environmental burden in different cases and how that environmental burden changes based on location, type of burden, community. And so in that way, we did some pre-work to get them to be thinking about it. Likewise, in their research paper, they had to talk about the stakeholders. And I'm not a fan of the word stakeholder, but for the lack of a better phrase, that's what I'm using at this moment. But I wanted them to think about all the different people that were involved in a particular situation. So when they were talking about water pollution, they were talking about Cancer Alley, and they were talking about Rise St. James and St. John the Baptist parishes here in Louisiana that were historically enslaved persons that were now living in areas where plants were right up abutting against them, and what were the complications they were experiencing and why, what was complicating action being taken. So that's kind of the way we got into that social space.
Thank you so much. That's really cool to hear.
So thank you. Danielle, you have a question.
Hi. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Thank you for your talk today. I really appreciate it and enjoyed it.
Thanks.
I'm an honors college student here at Southern Miss, and I'm not an environmental science major. So when I heard you say this was an honors college class at LSU, I was just wondering how those students who weren't necessarily environmental science majors, how you were able to get them engaged and interested when I'm a science major, but I'm not necessarily environmental science, how you kept them, engaged in a topic they may not know much about.
Oh, thanks. Thank you for that question. So, I will tell you that this course, it was for it was a general education credit for sciences, and so I had a lot of students that were non-science majors. And so what we did was we talked about how these topics relate to them in an everyday capacity. So we really leaned into, again, that community and how you as an individual are impacted by these aspects, and how you as an individual just living, it's important for you to understand what these are. And we did also flex into how this relates to the major that they were in. So if they were, going to be going into elementary education, or if they were going to go into I have some students that were, I said history, we had some art majors. I definitely had several engineers in my class, but we talked about what was the aspect that related directly to their major. And that was something that allowed us to kind of get excited. The other thing that I tried to do when we were having discussions in class on particular topics was I would encourage them to find current events that were of interest to them and share out in the class. And so during the water week, they could all kind of pull in for these things and we could talk about them. And then finally, I asked them, we would do a lot of personal kinds of questions. As much as they wanted to share, we could talk about that, Becky, as a person who is not from Louisiana but has lived here almost 20 years, what is my lived experience with this aspect, and how did I view Louisiana before I moved here? We got into that personal side.
Thank you. That's very interesting.
Thank you.
I have a question because
Yeah.
I know that a lot of our doctoral students in the STEM education program will be watching this too, and you have a very cool job. Um, can you talk a little bit about what your typical day looks like for you and kind of how you got involved in what you're doing? Because you do a lot of different kinds of things that I think many of our students would be interested in also.
I'm happy to. So as I kind of said at the beginning, this is an academic adjacent kind of position, and I should tell you that I came to Louisiana to LSU specifically because I was getting um, my dissertation in disturbance ecology, and so I spent multiple years burning the pine savanna and watching and evaluating how an invasive species, Japanese climbing fern, returned. And I was under the impression that I was going to go into research at a university, and I might teach. Prior to that, I was a Park Service employee, and I did all kinds of research, either in Shenandoah in Virginia or Joshua Tree in California. Got to drive tractors, got to set things on fire, got to count things, right? And all along the way, though, I should say that I was doing education. And so I was taking people out into the field and I was talking to them about processes and making connections. And when I came here, one of the first classes I started to teach was conservation biology in my wheelhouse. And around 2006, it was changed to a communication intensive course. And so CI. And it was certified in spoken and visual communication emphasis. And so I had taught that class before it was certified and then after. And I'm going to also tell you, I taught that class with 3 different faculty members as communication intensive. And it was by the time I was getting ready to graduate and I was trying to find a job, I recognized that I didn't want to go into research anymore, or at least what I initially thought, that I was fulfilled working with students and helping them with communication and helping them translate science ideas. And so I met Rebecca Burdett. She is our director. She offered me a position, and I walked across the stage and then came here into this. I got my diploma and I walked into this position. So on a day-to-day basis, that's a little, I should say that I work a lot with faculty. So like right now, we're doing a 1-day session. We're working with faculty to embed communication intensive components into their courses. And we are working with multiple different disciplines, but there is a me for those different disciplines that sits down with faculty. We brainstorm with them. We look at what they're already doing. We talk about what course goals are. Sometimes those meetings are in groups, like I said, upstairs. Sometimes they're just, one-on-one. I also work with students. So I am meeting with students who recognize that they want to work on how they communicate across modes. And I help them develop a website, so their personal e-portfolio is what we call it. I help them translate opportunities. So if they've been shadowing a physician, how do they make that connection to what's that next step? Because I'm in the sciences, I'm working with a lot of students that are wanting to go into graduate programs, industry, and healthcare. So those are kind of the examples I use. But even if they did an aerial silks class, I'm helping them think about that connection between movement of the body and what they're going to do. And we work a lot with then personal statement writing. We do workshops and collaborate with other units. On a day-to-day basis, I'm in a studio where we check out equipment. We help support our mentors that are meeting with students, doing writing appointments, speaking, and visuals. And kind of just in general, it's like I kind of never know what we're gonna do. We have to be pretty flexible, but I get to brainstorm most of the days, and I love that because I get to talk to somebody, I get to hear the cool thing they're doing, and then I get to kind of explore what could you do? What could happen here? That was a whole long-winded thing, Maria, but
Because you do a lot of things, but
it's
it's
a
a
lot of
very
things.
cool job. But I do remember brainstorming being a very common feature of like the day-to-day. It's just like with lots of different people.
Mm-hmm. And it's also because you're working with people from across the disciplines. I did share before we got started today, brainstorming, say, with Maria was really nice because she had a background in education coming in before her PhD, and she was able to share with me some tips and activities that I could embed with my science students that I didn't have that background. So that very much that lived experience, and then finding the commonality across them or finding different approaches, that's something that has been really valuable and fun when you're working with the different disciplines and the different experts. Oh, and thank you for dropping in some of that information. That's fantastic. Yes, I teach for the Honors College. I also teach now a class with our LSU has really ramped up their incoming freshman courses in their different colleges. So I teach one with the College of Science that is becoming a scientist and mathematician. We focus in on a lot of these skills that are particular for the science. We do a lot of things on ethics, diversity and inclusion. We talk about the importance of having ethics and diversity in science, as well as time management and stress relief and translating and finding reliable information. Yeah.
Okay, well, it is just past 1 o'clock, so we will be respectful of Dr. Carmichael's time, and I'm sure we could talk to her all day about the cool things she's doing at LSU. So, Dr. Carmichael, thank you so much for your time and your presentation. We really enjoyed the insight and what you're doing with your classes. So I think it gives some of us ideas on things that we may want to try out in some of our courses. So thank you.
Thank you. And please let me know if you have questions. I'll put my email here. I think that it might be on the flyer, but just in case, if you have questions, let me know. I'm happy to share things.
All right. Thank you so much and have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.